We're going to start with Austin because he's talking about what we don't support in Ukraine and by implication what we do. We'll see if we agree with him.
There are some Americans questioning whether the U.S. can afford to keep supporting Ukraine. Why does Ukraine still matter? And what is at stake if the U.S. stops funding Ukraine?
There's a lot at stake, Jen. We don't want to live in a world where a tyrant can wake up and decide to erase his sovereign neighbor's border. If Putin is successful, he will continue to do what he's done. All of the Baltic states are very concerned about. They rightfully feel that they would be next on the menu.
I mean, Matt, this is just basically the same kind of thing that just says, hey, this is like the Make-A-Wish Foundation to me. We don't want to wake up in a world where a tyrant, forget about which side actually is the tyrant, we'll leave that for another day, but where the tyrant, meaning somebody I don't like, can just wake up and change the borders arbitrarily, etc. That's you may wish something like that was true, but then when you look at the ground, again, if this was, say, February or March 2022, then there would at least be a plausible statement to make there. Well, if we support them, they can, but this is closing in on the third year of war. And let me show you just a small clip of Weeb Union, who did a really good, concise examination of just what's going on in the front right now. Watch this.
But we see that the Russians are really attacking on the entire eastern section of the front line, excluding Zaporizhia. There are talks of a upcoming Russian Zaporizhia offensive, and if the Russians successfully recapture Kursk as well, it is simply fighting on the entire section of the front line, and the Ukrainian lines are continuously diminishing in strength and nearing collapse. And to the ones who didn't believe the Russians will not collapse the Ukrainian lines, you're simply exaggerating, clickbaiting, and so on. Compare the fact that the Russians have captured about 70 square kilometers in a single day in a span of 24 hours in the Donetsk and Luhansk and Kharkiv regions here in the east, with no new front being opened, no significant maneuver warfare. The Russians have simply rotated their forces, sent in fresh units that has allowed for offensive operations to be pulled off on a large scale, and they are now overwhelming the Ukrainian defenses. If they break the Ukrainian lines in just one point, it will be devastating for the Ukrainians. If they do it at several points across the front line, then the Ukrainian lines could completely collapse.
So the things are deteriorating on the front. They're not static. It's not a frozen conflict. It is continuing to deteriorate. And as you hear there, in just a single 24-hour period, it's deteriorating faster. So like in the Israel Middle Eastern situation here, all this lying that we're doing is resulting in Palestinian people and Lebanese people and Yemenis people dying in increasingly large numbers. In this war, statements like Austin saying they're like, no, we're going to ignore all that and just keep on supplying and keeping the basically like the IV so that Ukraine can stay alive, meaning more and more Ukrainian men are dying for a war that cannot absolutely be won. And that it just underscores the immorality of it to me, despite the fact that it's just inaccurate.
Right. I think I think what the West, the Americans and the Brits and NATO are banking on is that the Russians are not going to push that far west. That even if you have a Ukrainian line collapse, that the Russians, of course, will take tactical advantage of it. They'll take operational advantage of it, but they will not proceed to push on to Kyiv. Type of thing, that they're not gonna go that far west because it's not in their interest to do so. That's not in their objective to do so. They don't want to become an occupier power, right? In terrain among a population that is Ukrainian oriented as opposed to Russian oriented, right? I mean, this goes beyond their original goals, right? I think that's what the West is banking on, is that even if you do have a collapse, that it will be momentary, that it will last for a week or two. There'll be this panic, and then the Russians will push forward. They'll solidify their lines, and the Ukrainians will be able to solidify some type of defense counter. And of course, the line will have moved 25 kilometers, 50 kilometers. But I mean, still, when you pull out on that map how far the Russians have actually advanced into Ukraine, I think is a source of comfort for many in the West. Now, of course, look at that analysis, look at that policy. This is what you're predicating it upon. This is what you're banking. This is what you're building your policy and your strategy on. Is that worse is going to happen, or it's likely that we will face a Ukrainian army collapse, that part of the front will collapse, the Russians will be able to push forward, they'll encircle a hell of a lot of Ukrainian troops, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? We expect the Russians not to really advance much farther. So it's okay. So getting your point of like, we're just going to keep shoveling Ukrainian men into this furnace and keep this war going because, well, it's a great grift. A lot of money is being made, but also too, this is what our narrative says. This is what our, this is what our we have spent our political capital on, and we got to keep this war going because we can't give it up. Otherwise, we'll embarrass ourselves by going back on, all this talk of tyrants and democracy versus authoritarianism. And then we'll have this question about what is the purpose of NATO and on and on and on. And these countries may cancel their contracts for F-35s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So really,
let me ask you this though. I mean, I've got the map up showing it, what you were talking about there, and you see how far Russia has come in, and you're like, okay, maybe they probably would not go past the Dnieper River if they wouldn't take it. Maybe they get all this stuff here, and okay. But here's the thing, from a practical perspective, take the morality out of it for a minute. If you don't care about all of the Ukrainian men who currently are fighting and dying in this area here, and the number that would also be killed substantially more if Russia eventually moves up to this line here among the Dnieper River, if that's the stop line, you hope, why not make a deal now to where this is here to prevent any more loss? And you still, at the end of the day, are in the same place. You still get a negotiated end to the war. And now then you could just ignore all the stuff that you've said and all this, whatever. I mean, people will say things maybe, but look what happened after Afghanistan. No one asked the hard questions after Afghanistan. They just kind of moved on. So why not do something like that now where you can control measures to a degree instead of just waiting to see what happens if there's a big collapse and a big movement on the front line?
Yeah, I know. It's insanity, isn't it? They could have had this, well, not just now, but 6 months ago, a year ago. Why not 2
years ago?
2 years ago, when General Milley was saying to do it, right? I mean, if he had negotiated then, and it's possible the Russians would have been receptive at that point. I think they would have been. If you had negotiated then, you would have much more territory in Ukrainian control than you have in Russian control. And of course, why didn't you allow the negotiations in the early parts of this invasion? Why didn't you negotiate when the Russians wanted to in the fall of 2021? I mean, because this is the psychology of these people. They can't. It's the imperial psychology. They can't admit defeat. They can't go against their own policy. They can't go against their own narrative. It's not even about the policy. It's about the narrative. And then particularly the Democratic Party, this is part of the larger Russiagate campaigning they've been doing for 10 years now. So now you're going to reverse and you're going to shake hands and sit down and talk with the tyrant, Vladimir Putin, who is your foreign stand-in for Donald Trump. You can't do that. I mean, so you have all these political and psychological reasons, these megalomaniacal reasons, not to do so, because it makes no sense. I mean, what I was describing there, I hope people don't misunderstand and saying that's what I think they should do or anything like that. I think that's what they're thinking. That we have this land we can give up and we can keep this thing going. And eventually the Russians will stabilize this because the Russians don't have the capacity to advance they don't have, more importantly, the desire to. They may have the capacity, but then they're giving up a heck of a lot. This idea of the Russians really are concerned about NATO coming into this war. If people want to understand why didn't they use their strategic reserve, why haven't they really? We hear about this 300,000 men that they have in reserve. Why haven't they used that just to roll through the Ukrainian lines? Why didn't they use them to kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk? It's because they are concerned about a war with NATO and they need to maintain their forces. They can't commit everything to this. So the idea of them pushing all the way to Kyiv and seizing Kyiv like some World War II style victory just isn't there. And I think that's what the West is depending upon. And at some point, the Russians will solidify their lines. They will say, and then at this point, you can basically just fire drones and rockets and missiles and artillery at each other. And, that's the way the war will go. And we will not have given up. NATO will still have its renewed purpose. The Donbass will be Jerusalem that we have to retake, and, the narrative remains in place.
Yeah, well, that's again what I think a lot of these folks think that can happen.
Yeah.
But in the last few minutes we have here, I'm going to kind of pull the lens back a little bit and see that there's more at stake here. Number one, we're not the only game in town anymore. So we've talked about this several times. There's a BRICS summits going on, and there's a definite geopolitical shift that's in the process of going on. And when people around the world, not just in the West, but potentially even at that some point, the eyes can be open to that. When they see the United States-led Western world, they see us fighting a war in Ukraine that's clearly militarily already lost, but we're not going to stop it. We're just going to keep on funding it no matter how many dies. That's what they see. And they see in the Middle East that Israel is conducting genocide in the Gaza Strip and horrible atrocities in the West Bank. And now then they're potentially going to annex another country or portion of southern Lebanon, and they're about to launch something into Iran potentially. They also see the United States going into the Indo-Pacific and giving these huge weapons packages to Taiwan to try and, I don't know what the intent is, whether it's to actually get them to go independence or whatever, but that's what the net positive net result is. And then we see lots of these ships going through the Taiwan Strait, which angers China. They see all of that. That's how we respond to things. Now then, here's the new center emerging to where people see this big economic and military and nuclear weapons power, China and Russia, having a different viewpoint. Watch this one.
We must uphold the three key principles, namely no expansion of the battlefields, no escalation of hostilities, and no fanning flames, and strive for swift de-escalation of the situation. While the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, the flames of war have once again been rekindled in Lebanon, and conflicts are escalating among the parties. We must promote an immediate ceasefire and an end to the killing. We must make unremitting efforts toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting resolution of the Palestinian question.
You see, I mean, China, even before all this stuff started, they actually brokered something like a peace, or at least an improved relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia before all of this stuff blew up. So this is not just Johnny come lately. I mean, that actually is their condition. So when you see this new block affirming, and let's see, the Brazil and I think India are also really in this peace party situation where they want to bring peace to the world, not more conflict. And China is expanding in ways that's economically, there's win-win potential for other countries involved here. They're not sending their military places. What do you see as the at least medium and maybe even long-term risk to the United States and the Western world if we keep going down the world I described, while the China, Russia, India, Brazil, et cetera, keep moving in this other direction?
Oh, the risks are great. And I mean, the risks are great, right, for any declining empire. But we're doing everything we can, Danny, as you laid out so well just a couple of moments ago, with ensuring that our decline is as hastened or as quick as possible because of our behavior. So you see the long list of nations. I think the expectation is 30 nations are going to apply for BRICS. There's already 9 members. In addition to that 30 who want to apply for BRICS, there's about 60 or 70 who are interested in BRICS. I mean, you had this conference where 22 heads of states, were there. I mean, the seriousness of this and the forcefulness of this is being emboldened, is being furthered by the United States' own behavior. Nations are saying we need to do something because there is no protection from the U.S. So the U.S. will do whatever it wants, and its empire will do whatever it wants unless we band together. And so BRICS, which has been around for at least 20 years, longer than that, I think, in the last several years, has really accelerated because of the behavior of the United States, whether it's the world looking at what it's doing with regards to Ukraine, as you were saying, willing to just allow this war to go on, an unwinnable war, just essentially to prove a point that we can put our missiles and troops wherever we want them to. That's essentially what this war is about, as well as we will also do what we can to destroy a market, say like the European energy market, in order to then sell them our natural gas. right? I mean, and then of course with Israel, our defense of them, our support of them, our willingness to just go along. Look, I mean, right now we are on, this is one thing that is just incredible to me, how we are just in this stasis, how we are just all waiting for Israel to attack Iran as if it's just the next installment of a television series or something like that, knowing that the response from Iran could be the response that leads to a major regional war. And we're just going along with it. And the world sees this. The world is trapped in the same way, but by themselves, they can't do anything. Look at the Turks. The Turks right now cannot do anything about Israel because, one, Israel has a nuclear weapon. This is why I think Turkey will get a nuclear weapon in 5 to 10 years, if not sooner. And the other is that it's also the American empire. So you got to go against the American empire. Well, now if you realign yourself and you have partners like Brazil, like India, like Russia, like China, like Iran, like 20 some odd other nations potentially, then you have much of a better chance standing up to the American empire. But importantly, I want to go back to what you said, though, Danny. It's about the perspective. It's about the worldview. It's about what they're trying to accomplish. First and foremost, BRICS is an economic union. It's an economic relationship. That's what it always has been. That's what it's meant to be. It's the West, it's the Americans, it's our empire that's forcing this discussion about BRICS in terms of a security or a military alliance, something that was never intended to, something I'm sure if we talk to the people at BRICS about, they would scoff at and be offended by. But that's our perspective, right? That's what we're forcing onto them. And so, this idea of what are they trying to accomplish, their worldview, what they mean to bring about, as opposed to what we bring about, what our empire brings about, that again shows you why nations are lining up to join BRICS. That hastens America's decline, and it further isolates the U.S. And then you get into all kinds of other issues, is that we have benefited from 80 years of an economic and financial world order, a monetary world order that we created, that we put in place after World War II. And this is the undoing of that. And so for the American public, something I don't think anyone here understands is we have an economy dependent upon that. We have an economy dependent on a strong dollar, right? That we can import for much cheaper than we can actually make things. This is why we have no manufacturing in this country. We have no industry. We import everything we consume, or nearly everything we consume, or a lot of it. What happens when that strong dollar, because it's strong because the world's reserve currency, when that falls apart, when the bottom falls out of that, when all of a sudden we have a weak dollar and we're still importing everything we need for the most part, what's going to happen to the American economy and the American public because of that, right? I mean, that's a crisis that, maybe you could speculate a number of years ago, oh, that's a crisis for 2045, 2055, 2070. But that's a crisis that we really could see in the next 10 years, say. And there's a lot of, very reasonable, sober people who are saying such things because, again, our own actions are
accelerating. Yeah, that move. That's exactly right. I couldn't agree with you more. Listen, we're going to continue to monitor this, especially as you said, we're waiting to find out what Israel's going to do. I think it's a certainty that they're going to do something, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But thank you very much for coming on today. It is always providing such clarity and such granular truth to what's going on besides the comments that are made. So appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Danny.
And we thank you guys too. Again, always remind you to like and subscribe. And we will see you on our next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. But also to remember, we have an Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive because I know you can't always watch the videos, but we don't want you to miss a single episode. Thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next episode tomorrow.